Lila was a display piece, a beauty in a shimmering red dress trapped in Victor's high-rise lounge, until one high-stakes deal changed everything. When Korean Mafia boss Min-jun is offered the world to settle a territory dispute, he shocks the underworld by choosing her. What starts as a transfer of property becomes a fierce act of protection. But when Victor realizes he has lost his prize and refuses to let go of the woman he once owned, Min-jun proves that touching what is his comes at a devastating price. Lila adjusted the thin spaghetti strap of her sequined red dress, her face a mask of practiced indifference. The sequins scratched against her skin, a constant, glittering reminder of the costume Victor forced her to wear. She stood in the shadows of the VIP penthouse, holding a silver tray of vintage reserve, her feet throbbing in high stilettos. Pain had become a familiar companion during her time working off her family's debt in this lounge, as constant as the leering eyes that followed her across the room. Victor sat at the head of the glass table, swirling his drink, drunk on his own power. He was loud, taking up too much space, celebrating a victory he hadn't won yet. Across from him sat Min-jun, a statue of stillness. Min-jun's suit was navy and sharp, but the intricate tattoos of dragons and koi creeping up his neck and extending onto his knuckles hinted at the violence beneath the polish. He didn't touch his drink. His dark, intense eyes revealed nothing. The tension between the two factions was palpable, a living thing that had been growing for months. Today's meeting was supposed to end the war over the shipping districts. Lila moved toward the table, trying to be invisible, though the red dress made that impossible. She had learned that silence was survival in Victor's world. "Refill," Victor snapped, not bothering to look at her face, only at the curve of her waist. Lila approached and reached for his glass. As she poured, Victor suddenly reached out and grabbed her wrist, pulling her uncomfortably close to the table to show her off to his guests. A splash of wine threatened to spill, but Lila's hand held steady through sheer will. "See this? Top quality," Victor boasted, squeezing her wrist hard enough to bruise. "Everything in this establishment is top tier. The drinks, the view, the service." Heat flooded Lila's cheeks, but she kept her eyes down, her jaw clenched. Min-jun's guards watched impassively, but Min-jun's gaze shifted. It didn't track Victor's hand, it tracked the fear in Lila's eyes. He saw the person beneath the sequins. "Let her go," Min-jun said. His voice was low, raspy, and carried an authority that made the air in the room drop 10 degrees. Victor laughed, a cruel bark of amusement, and shoved Lila away. She stumbled but caught herself, clutching the tray like a shield. "Relax, Min-jun. Just having a little fun. You Koreans are always so serious." Min-jun's expression remained neutral, though the muscles in his jaw ticked. He leaned back in his chair, his tattooed fingers drumming once on the table. "Shall we conclude our business?" Victor waved his hand dismissively. Yes, let's end this. You wanted to negotiate, so negotiate. What will it take for you to back off my territory? I'm feeling generous today." Min-jun was silent for a long moment. His gaze moved slowly around the room. It passed over Victor's smug expression, over the bodyguards standing at attention, and finally it landed on Lila. She felt the weight of that look, felt seen in a way that was both terrifying and strangely compelling. His dark eyes held hers for a heartbeat. 1, 2, 3. "You said you could choose anything to end this feud, anything at all." "Within reason," Victor said impatiently, spreading his arms wide. "Cash, the downtown docks, the casinos, name your price." Min-jun turned back to Victor, and when he spoke, his voice was perfectly clear. "I choose her." He pointed a tattooed finger directly at Lila, the woman in the red dress. "The waitress. I want her." The silence that followed was absolute, a vacuum of sound that seemed to suck the air from the room. Then Victor began to laugh, a genuine belly laugh of disbelief. His men joined in, their chuckles echoing off the glass walls. "The waitress?" Victor gasped between laughs. "You're joking. You must be joking. You want the girl instead of the casinos? This is absurd." She's nothing, Victor sneered, wiping a tear from his eye. She's just overhead, a debt slave. She is enough. Minjun's voice cut through the laughter like a blade. He stood slowly, and the laughter died in throats, choked off by the lethal intent radiating from him. I don't recall asking for commentary. Victor, you gave your word. Anything I wanted. Do you intend to break your word in front of your lieutenants? The amusement drained from Victor's face, replaced by calculation. You're serious? Completely? Minjun didn't blink. Victor shrugged, his indifference more cutting than any insult. Fine, take her. Good riddance, honestly. One less mouth to feed. He waved his hand as if brushing away an insect. She's yours. We're done here. Minjun crossed the room to where Lila stood, frozen, still clutching the tray. The other men watched, confused, but Minjun ignored them. He stopped in front of her. Come with me, he said, and this time his voice was gentle. Lila's mind reeled. Nothing made sense. Was she being sold? Was this a trick? But Minjun extended his hand, palm up, waiting, not grabbing, and his eyes held something she hadn't seen directed at her in years: respect. Her legs moved before her mind fully decided. She set down the tray with shaking hands and placed her fingers in his. Minjun's hand closed around hers, warm, firm, and safe. He led her out of the VIP room, past Victor's dismissive sneer, and toward the elevator. As the doors closed, shutting out the noise of the lounge, Minjun immediately shrugged off his navy suit jacket. He wrapped it around Lila's shoulders, covering the exposed skin the red dress left bare, hiding her from the world. Why? Lila whispered, pulling the jacket tighter, smelling his expensive cologne and the faint scent of ink. Minjun pressed the button for the ground floor, his eyes fixed forward, his jaw set. Because, he said quietly, you don't belong to them anymore. The elevator descent felt like falling. Lila watched the floor numbers drop, her heart hammering against her ribs in a rhythm of panic. Beside her, Minjun was a monolith, silent and unmoving, though he positioned himself between her and the doors, as if a threat to burst through. When the doors slid open, he didn't speak. He simply led her through the polished lobby, past the confused stares of the night staff, who knew her only as the property of the penthouse. They stepped out into the night, and the wind hit Layla like a physical blow. The temperature had plummeted, turning the city into an icebox. Her sequined dress, designed for the humid, smoke-filled air of the lounge, was useless here. The thin spaghetti straps dug into her skin, and the high slit that Victor loved so much let the biting wind wrap around her bare legs. She gasped, her teeth instantly chattering, her arms wrapping around her waist in a futile attempt to hold onto body heat. Minjun stopped abruptly. He looked at her, his gaze sweeping over her shivering form. His dark eyes narrowed, darkening further with something that looked like irritation, not at her, but at the situation. At the dress. Without a word, he shrugged off his navy suit jacket. Under the harsh streetlights, stripped of the dark wool, he looked even more dangerous. The pristine white dress shirt clung to his lean frame, the fabric translucent enough to show the dark, swirling shadows of ink that covered his chest and back. The tattoos on his neck seemed to come alive as he moved, intricate dragons winding down his arms, disappearing into the cuffs. He stepped into her personal space, blocking the wind with his body. He draped the heavy jacket over her shoulders. It was massive on her, engulfing her frame in warmth and the scent of sandalwood and steel. But he didn't stop there. Minjun's fingers, stained with ink and scarred from violence, moved with surprising dexterity. He buttoned the jacket from the bottom up. He wasn't just keeping her warm, he was hiding her. He buttoned it all the way to her chin, concealing every inch of the shimmering red sequins, erasing the brand Victor had put on her. Better, he murmured, his voice a low rumble against the noise of the traffic. He looked at his handiwork with a nod of satisfaction. She was no longer a display piece. She was a shapeless form wrapped in his colors. Layla looked up at him, buried in his scent, feeling the first true warmth she'd felt in years. "You're cold," she whispered, looking at his thin shirt. "I don't feel the cold," Minjun replied simply. He placed a hand on her back, on the fabric of his own jacket, and guided her toward the waiting black sedan. "Get in. We're leaving this place behind." The penthouse was a fortress of glass and silence, perched so high above the city that the chaotic noise of the streets below was nothing but a memory. The space was stark and aggressively modern, poured concrete floors, low-profile Italian furniture, and walls of windows that turned the skyline into living art. Layla stood in the center of the living room, clutching the lapels of Minjun's jacket tight against her throat. Against the sharp, monochromatic lines of his home, she felt like a chaotic smear of color. The red sequins of her dress, hidden beneath the wool but burning against her skin, felt cheap here, gaudy. She felt ridiculous, a showgirl stumbling into a museum, carrying the scent of stale wine and fear into a sanctuary that smelled of rain and stone. Min-jun moved through the space like he was part of the architecture, sharp, silent, and imposing. He didn't offer a tour, he didn't turn on music or pour drinks, he simply walked down a long corridor, expecting her to follow. She trailed behind him, her heels clicking too loudly on the polished floor. He stopped at a door at the end of the hall and pushed it open. "This is yours," he said. Layla stepped inside. It was a guest suite, larger than the entire apartment she had shared with her family before the debt swallowed them. The bed was massive, dressed in white linens that looked crisp enough to snap. There were no bars on the windows, no locks on the outside of the door. She turned to him, waiting for the other shoe to drop, waiting for the demand that always followed a transaction. "What do you want me to do?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Min-jun didn't answer. Instead, he walked to a sleek dresser built into the wall. He pulled open a drawer and retrieved a stack of folded fabric, placing it on the edge of the bed. It wasn't silk or lace. It was heavy, slate-gray cashmere, sweatpants, and a matching oversized hoodie. He turned to face her, his gaze landing on the jacket she was still clutching. He knew what was underneath it. He knew exactly how much skin that red dress exposed, how it was designed to make her a feast for the eyes of men like Victor. His jaw tightened, a muscle feathering beneath the dragon tattoo on his neck. "Take that thing off," Min-jun ordered, gesturing vaguely at the red gown hidden beneath his coat. "Burn it if you have to. You aren't on display here." With that, he closed the door, leaving her alone in the quiet. The red dress lay in a heap on the white-tiled floor, a shed skin of shimmering scales that belonged to a life she was trying to escape. Layla stared at it for a long moment before kicking it into the far corner. The shower had been scalding, scrubbing away the scent of cigar smoke and the phantom feel of Victor's gaze. But it was the act of washing her face that felt the most radical. She stood before the mirror, gripping the edges of the porcelain sink until her knuckles turned white. Without the layers of foundation, the sharp winged eyeliner, and the blood-red lipstick Victor insisted on, she looked younger, stranger. The purple shadows of exhaustion under her eyes were visible now, as was the small scar on her chin. She pulled the hood of the oversized gray cashmere hoodie up, hiding her damp hair. The fabric was impossibly soft, swallowing her slender frame, making her feel small, but for the first time in years, completely covered. She looked like a ghost of the woman who had served wine an hour ago. Vulnerable, plain, unguarded. A scent drifted under the door, savory, rich, and grounding. Garlic, ginger, and sesame oil. It pulled her out of the sanctuary of the bathroom and down the dark hallway, her bare feet silent on the cold concrete floor. She found Min-jun in the kitchen. The sight stopped her dead. The terrifying crime lord who had stared down an entire room of gangsters was standing at a massive slate island, chopping green onions with rhythmic, terrifying precision. He had discarded his dress shirt for a simple black t-shirt, exposing the full tapestry of ink on his arms. The black and gray dragons writhed with every movement of his muscles as he worked the knife. He didn't turn around, but the rhythm of the knife paused. "Hungry?" Lila stepped into the soft lighting of the kitchen, pulling the long sleeves of the sweatshirt down over her hands until only her fingertips showed. I didn't know you cooked. People assume I only know how to destroy things, Minjun said quietly. He scraped the vegetables into a sizzling pan, the sound filling the heavy silence. He set the knife down and finally turned to face her. Lila instinctively stiffened, her chin tucking down. She knew what men like Victor wanted, the fantasy, the high-gloss polish, the red dress. She was offering him nothing but her bare, exhausted self. She waited for the criticism, for him to tell her to go put the paint back on. Minjun's dark eyes swept over her. He took in the damp curls escaping her hood, her scrubbed clean skin, and the way his clothes hung off her shoulders. He didn't look disappointed. He looked relieved. He leaned back against the counter, crossing his tattooed arms over his chest. The intensity in his gaze softened, just a fraction. "It's an improvement," he said, his voice low and serious. "I look like a mess," Lila whispered, self-conscious, her hand going to her bare face. "No," Minjun corrected her. "You looked like a doll in that club, painted and plastic." He turned back to the stove, picking up a wooden spoon. "Now you look real. I prefer real." The days in the penthouse bled together in a haze of quiet healing. Lila sat at the kitchen island, the morning light spilling through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the intricate web of ballpoint ink she was weaving on a paper napkin. It was a nervous habit, a compulsion she thought Victor had beaten out of her. She was sketching the skyline, but twisted, darker, the buildings looking like jagged teeth. A shadow fell over her hand. Lila flinched, instinctively covering the drawing, waiting for a reprimand for wasting time. Minjun stood there, a mug of black coffee in his hand. He didn't scold her. He gently reached out, his tattooed fingers prying her hand away from the napkin. He studied the sketch for a long moment, his face impassive. "You have training," he stated. It wasn't a question. "I was an art student. Before the debt. Before everything." Minjun hummed, a low vibration in his chest. He set the napkin down with a care that contradicted his lethal reputation. "Come with me." He led her to the east wing of the penthouse, a section she hadn't dared to explore. He stopped before a set of double doors and pushed them open. Layla's breath caught in her throat. The room was flooded with northern light, the kind painters prayed for. The smell hit her instantly. Linseed oil, turpentine, and fresh canvas, a scent she hadn't smelled in 3 years. Easels stood like sentinels in the center of the room, surrounded by tables laden with high-quality paints, brushes of every size, and charcoal sticks. "I had it cleared out," Minjun said, standing behind her. "Talent like yours shouldn't die on a napkin." "Minjun," she gasped, turning to him, her eyes welling up. "I can't repay you for this." "I didn't ask you to," he replied, his gaze intense. "Just paint. Create something that belongs to you." For the next week, Layla lived in that room. She painted with a feverish intensity, exorcising the ghosts of the lounge with every stroke. She didn't paint the skyline, and she didn't paint herself. She painted a dragon. It wasn't a traditional beast. It was a storm of charcoal and midnight blue oils, a massive, coiling creature with scales that looked like armor. It was terrifying, with claws that could tear the world apart. But its posture wasn't aggressive. It was curled around a small, fragile point of light, shielding it from the encroaching darkness. Minjun found her one evening, covered in smudges of paint, staring at the finished canvas. He walked up beside her, his eyes tracing the familiar curves of the beast, the same dragon that was inked into his own skin. He understood immediately. He saw the violence in the painting, yes, but he also saw the tenderness in the dragon's protective coil. "Is this how you see me?" he asked, his voice rough. Layla looked at him, seeing the man who had wrapped her in his jacket, who had given her back her art. "Yes," she whispered. "Fierce and safe." The piece Minjun had built for her was fragile, constructed of glass walls and silence, and it shattered with the arrival of a single black box.
It sat on the entryway console, innocuous and sleek, delivered by a private courier. Layla, still wiping paint from her hands, approached it with a curiosity that quickly curdled into dread. There was no return address, but the heavy, matte texture of the packaging felt familiar. It felt expensive. It felt like a trap. Her fingers trembled as she lifted the lid. Red, violent, shimmering blood-red silk spilled like a fresh wound against the stark white of the penthouse. It wasn't just a dress. It was a replica of the one she had worn the night Min-jun claimed her, cut even lower, the fabric sheerer. Nestled on top was a card on thick cream stock. "Don't forget who made you beautiful. V." The air left the room. Layla dropped the lid, stumbling back until her spine hit the wall. The hallway began to tilt. The smell of paint and rain vanished, replaced by the phantom stench of stale cigars and Victor's cloying cologne. She clawed at the neck of her oversized hoodie, suddenly feeling the phantom scratch of sequins against her skin, the weight of a serving tray, the pinch of Victor's fingers on her arm. "No," she gasped, sliding down the wall, her knees drawn to her chest. She didn't hear Min-jun approach. She only registered his presence when a large, warm hand settled on her shoulder. She flinched violently, a cry tearing from her throat. Min-jun froze. He looked from her terrified face to the open box on the table. His expression didn't shift into anger. It went completely dead. It was a look of cold, absolute zero. He stepped past her, moving with a lethal grace, and snatched the card from the box. He read it once, his jaw flexing so hard the dragon tattoo on his neck rippled.
He didn't say a word. He didn't crumble the note. He simply picked up the entire box, the red silk trailing out like a tongue, and marched to the floor-to-ceiling glass doors. He slid one open. The wind howled, invading the sanctuary, whipping his black t-shirt against his chest. Lila watched through her tears, paralyzed. Min-jun stepped onto the balcony. He held the box over the railing, looking at it with the same disdain one would look at a dead rat. Then he let go. He watched it fall, a speck of red swallowed by the gray city hundreds of feet below. He slid the door shut, locking the wind and the world out again. When he turned back to her, the coldness in his eyes had melted into fierce concern. He crossed the room and crouched in front of her, taking her trembling hands in his. "He cannot reach you here," Min-jun promised, his voice low and iron-hard. "He is the past, and I threw him in the trash where he belongs." The International Trade Summit was a sea of black ties and polite cruelty, a place where wars were started with a handshake. But tonight, all eyes were on the woman standing beside the Korean crime lord. Lila wore emerald green. The gown was nothing like the red scraps of silk Victor had forced onto her body. This dress was heavy satin, long-sleeved and high-necked, cascading to the floor in a pool of dark, regal color. It didn't reveal her skin. It framed her face. It commanded respect. Min-jun kept his hand firmly on the small of her back, a warm, grounding weight that told the room she was not a servant. She was with him. "Breathe," Min-jun whispered against her ear as they navigated the crowd. "You are a queen among thieves. Act like it." For an hour, she believed him. She sipped sparkling water, head held high, until a sudden wave of business partners pulled Min-jun into a circle of urgent negotiation. He hesitated, his eyes dark with reluctance, but Lila squeezed his hand. "I'll be right here," she promised, stepping back toward the quieter edge of the room, near a corridor of private meeting suites. It was a mistake. The moment Min-jun's back turned, a hand clamped around her upper arm. It wasn't the gentle touch she had grown used to. It was a claw. Lila was yanked sideways, stumbling in her heels, dragged out of the ballroom and into the dim, carpeted silence of the service corridor. The smell hit her first, expensive brandy and rot.
Victor shoved her against the wall, boxing her in. His face was twisted, veins bulging in his neck, his eyes scanning her dress with pure, unadulterated loathing. "What is this?" Victor hissed, gesturing violently at the emerald gown. "You look like a nun, a dowdy, boring nun." "Let me go," Lila gasped, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She tried to push past him, but he slammed his hand against the wall by her head. "Where is the red dress?" he demanded, leaning in close, his breath hot on her face. "I burned it," Lila said, her voice shaking but defiant. "I don't wear your clothes anymore. I don't belong to you." Victor's face went purple. The humiliation of losing her, of seeing her standing tall and covered in another man's colors, snapped the last thread of his composure. He grabbed a fistful of the expensive green silk at her shoulder. "You belong where I say you belong," he snarled, tightening his grip until the fabric strained. "You think playing dress-up with that Korean dog changes what you are? You're a waitress. You're a debt. Come here." He yanked her forward, trying to drag her deeper into the shadows of the hallway, away from the light, away from safety. Lila screamed, the sound tearing through the polite silence of the summit. The sound of Lila's scream shattered the polite hum of the summit like a gunshot. Inside the ballroom, Minjun didn't freeze. He didn't look around in confusion. He simply dropped his crystal tumbler, the glass exploding on the marble floor, and turned toward the corridor. The veneer of the civilized businessman evaporated instantly. The man who moved toward the exit wasn't a CEO. He was the dragon of the East, and he was hunting. He rounded the corner just as Victor raised his hand to strike her. Two of Victor's bodyguards stepped forward to intercept him, reaching inside their jackets. They never finished the motion. Minjun didn't break stride. He caught the first man's wrist, twisting it with a sickening snap of cartilage, and drove his elbow into the man's throat. As the guard gagged and collapsed, Minjun pivoted, driving the heel of his polished shoe into the second man's knee, shattering the joint. It took 3 seconds. Victor froze, his hand still tangled in the green silk of Lila's dress, his eyes widening as he registered the bodies on the floor. He opened his mouth to speak, to bluster, to threaten, but Minjun was already there. Minjun didn't punch him. He grabbed Victor by the throat, his tattooed fingers digging deep into the soft flesh, and lifted him off his feet. With a roar of exertion, Minjun slammed him backward. Victor's head connected with the drywall with a thunderous crack, leaving a spiderweb of fractures in the plaster. Lila scrambled back, clutching her torn sleeve, her chest heaving. She watched as Minjun pinned Victor against the wall, his forearm pressing against the man's windpipe, cutting off his air. Victor clawed at Minjun's arm, his face turning a mottled red, his feet kicking uselessly at the air. Minjun brought his face inches from Victor. The calm, unnerving silence returned, but now it was heavier, suffocating. The dragon tattoo on Minjun's neck seemed to pulse with the rhythm of his rage. "You," Minjun whispered, the sound terrifyingly intimate. "You touched her." Victor sputtered, eyes rolling back, desperate for oxygen. Minjun loosened his grip just enough to let him wheeze, but kept him pinned. "Look at me," Minjun commanded softly. Victor obeyed, terrified. "You like to watch her?" Minjun asked, his voice devoid of any human warmth. "You like to look at her in the red dress?" He leaned closer, his dark eyes boring into Victor's soul. "If you ever look at her again, if you ever even glance in her direction, I will carve your eyes out of your skull with a dull spoon. Do you understand?" Victor nodded frantically, tears of pain leaking from his eyes. Minjun held him there for a second longer, letting the promise sink into the marrow of Victor's bones. Then, with a look of utter disgust, he released him. Victor crumpled to the floor, gasping and retching, a broken king in a ruined suit. Minjun didn't look at him again. He turned to Lila, the rage instantly vanishing as he reached out to touch her cheek with a trembling hand. The physical bruises on Victor were not enough. Minju knew that men like Victor healed from broken bones. They did not heal from poverty. Back in the penthouse, while Lila slept a fitful, exhausted sleep, Minjun declared war on the skyline. He sat in his glass-walled office, the city spread out below him like a game board. He didn't scream. He didn't throw things. He simply spoke into his phone with the terrifying calm of an executioner. "Buy it," Minjun ordered, his voice flat. "The entire building, the sublot, the air rights, the commercial leases, I want the deed in my name by sunrise." On the other end of the line, a team of lawyers and fixers scrambled, moving millions of dollars through offshore accounts in a digital blitzkrieg. Victor's loan sharks were paid off, and the debt transferred to Minjun. Victor's suppliers were bought out. The very ground beneath Victor's high-rise club was snatched away while the man was still icing his bruised throat. When Lila woke the next morning, the sun was blinding. She found Minjun standing on the balcony, a single piece of paper in his hand. He looked tired, the ink on his neck stark against his pale skin, but his eyes were burning with a dark satisfaction. "It's over," he said as she stepped outside, wrapping her arms around herself against the morning chill. He handed her the paper. It was a property deed transfer. "I bought the building," Minjun explained, his voice devoid of emotion. "Victor's lease had a clause, immediate eviction upon change of ownership. My security team is clearing out the lounge as we speak. They are putting his velvet ropes, his expensive liquor, and his cheap furniture on the curb."
Lila stared at the paper, her mind struggling to comprehend the scale of it. "You bought a skyscraper just to fire him?" "I bought it to erase him," Minjun corrected gently. "I froze his accounts. I exposed his ledger to the authorities. He has no club. He has no money. He doesn't even have a home to go back to. He is a king of nothing." He reached out, tucking a loose curl behind her ear, his touch grounding her as the reality settled in. The cage wasn't just open, it was demolished. "He isn't just defeated," Minjun whispered, looking out at the city he now commanded completely. "He is evicted from your life." The city sprawled beneath them, no longer a labyrinth of threats, but a kingdom brought to heel. It was a year to the day since the red dress had fallen into the abyss, and the evening breeze that swept across the penthouse balcony carried the warmth of summer rather than the bite of winter. Lila leaned against the glass railing, the setting sun painting her skin in shades of amber and gold. She wore white linen, a simple, flowing sundress that caught the wind. There were no sequins, no tight straps, no restrictive corsetry. It was a dress chosen for comfort, for a woman who no longer needed to armor herself against the gaze of predatory men. Minjun stepped out to join her, 2 crystal tumblers of scotch in his hand. He set them on the small table and moved behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. His touch was possessive but grounding, the anchor that kept her steady. He rested his chin on her shoulder, his breath warm against her ear. "It is quiet tonight," Minjun murmured, looking out at the twinkling grid of the financial district, a district they now effectively owned. Too quiet, perhaps. Lila hemmed, leaning back into his solid warmth. "I like the quiet." "Do you?" He tightened his hold slightly, a question lingering in his tone. "Sometimes I wonder if you miss the noise, the adrenaline, the chaos of the club. You spent years in the center of the storm, Lila. This domesticity, it is a drastic change." Lila turned in his arms, facing him. She looked up into the dark eyes that had once terrified her, tracing the sharp line of his jaw with her thumb. She remembered the fear, the exhaustion, the feeling of being an object on a shelf. She remembered the red dress. She laughed softly, a sound that was light and completely free. "Minjun, that wasn't excitement, that was survival. I don't miss fighting for my life."
She rose onto her tiptoes and pressed her lips to the side of his neck, right over the dark, coiling ink of the dragon tattoo. She kissed the mark of the beast that the world feared, claiming it as her own. "I don't need the noise," she whispered against his skin. "I have everything I want right here." Minjun's expression softened, the hard lines of the crime lord melting into the devotion of a husband. He kissed her forehead, a benediction. "Then let it stay quiet," he vowed. They turned back to the view, standing side by side. Below them, the city lights flickered on one by one, illuminating the streets where they had once fought to survive. Now, the skyline didn't look like a cage, it looked like a throne room, and as they watched the world turn beneath them, they knew they would never be powerless again.